50 years ago, and my goodness, it pains me to say that, 50 years ago, I was the director of women's housing at a university in Texas. When I took over the job, there was still one women's residence hall, Smith Hall, that had a curfew, which irritated me greatly. I was young, and I admittedly still chafed against the curfews that had been my constant reality in college. I was contemptuous of the argument that curfews were designed to protect women from presumably men. My counter-argument was always that if men were the problem, then they were the ones who should have the curfew. Am I right, ladies? Yes. All right. In any case, the women of Smith Hall were overwhelmingly in favor of getting rid of their curfew. Even the elderly house mother, who I now realize was younger than I am now, anyway, she was also in favor. In her words, a curfew insulted her girls. So we did all the due diligence, and I got all the right signatures, and when spring semester came, there was no curfew at Smith Hall. And that's when it got interesting. Over the course of the semester, I talked to quite a few of those residents, and I, of course, would always casually ask how the curfew change was going. And they all said basically the same thing. No curfew was great, but there had been some advantages to having it, actually. And when probed on that comment, what I got again and again was this. The thing about curfew was that if you were on an unsatisfactory date, you could always say, hey, I got to get back or I'll get in trouble for missing curfew. But now, without curfew, if you wanted an unsatisfactory date to end, well, now you had to assert your own wishes. And it turns out that was really difficult. Those conversations on freedom and responsibility were in education, and frankly, perhaps most of all for me. I remember thinking how odd it was that all of us girls had been taught since middle school that it was our responsibilities to make sure that a boy didn't go too far. You remember that line? Male behavior was on us. But no one had ever taught us girls about what it meant simply to be free, to be in charge of ourselves. Now, I had not thought about that experience for, frankly, decades. But this week, it popped out of the memory hole into my consciousness, and frankly, I blame Paul. The 5th chapter of Galatians is a little treatise on freedom. It begins, "For freedom, Christ set you free." And so I've been thinking a lot about what it is that we mean by the word freedom. Now, once upon a time, I would have said I understood what Americans at least meant by freedom, sort of the high school civics class version of this. We have freedom of religion and the right to free speech and the right to a fair trial, and we have the right to vote. And I was older when I understood that not all Americans had been included in those precious rights. I was older still when I learned the painful details about the long and ongoing struggle of blacks and people of color, and of gay people, and of women to be included under the liberties promised by the Constitution. But even so, my heart remained optimistic about freedom's progress. And now, well, for me, optimism has become more difficult. We all know that we were currently living in a country where the definition of freedom, the definition of liberty, has become fraught, shall we say. There's the obvious stuff, isn't there? The stark ruling this past week from the Supreme Court that women do not, in fact, have self-sovereignty over their own bodies. There's the ongoing efforts to restrict the right to vote with the not-so-hidden goal of restricting the voting of people of color. There's the, frankly, conspiracy to make sure election officials are not impartial at all. And there's more. These past 3 years, maybe I'm just ranting to myself, but I have a sense that you probably share these things with me. We've seen a definition of freedom that seems to mean never having to do something that you don't want to do. Sort of the 2-year-old's version of freedom. I'm sure that you share my shock of the tens of thousands of people who claimed that their ultimate definition of liberty was to not wear a face mask during a global pandemic, including those who claimed the freedom to physically assault anyone who asked them to do so. I'm betting that your heart sank at the spectacle of a violent insurrection because one political party lost an election. I'm sure that you are appalled at the ugliness of our public discourse, a discourse that seems to suggest that many of our fellow citizens believe that they should be free from any opinion that they do not share and may freely attack anyone who disagrees with them. In general, freedom seems increasingly to mean do what you want without regard for other people. I'm going to give you a case in point. This past week, I found myself staring way too long at a young man photographed in Oklahoma. I was staring because this thin man with a scraggly beard was decked out in the oddest outfit I have ever seen. He was wearing what looked to be boxer shorts, and then one of those Army tactical vests, and he had some sort of headgear that held his sunglasses. And then there was the holster on his right hip with what looked to be a revolver from one of those old westerns we used to watch. And cradled in his arms was a military-grade assault rifle. This was the outfit in which he was walking around downtown in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, sort of I would call it a Rambo goes shopping at Target look. I have no idea why he was doing this. I don't think anyone does. But I do know what happened. Chaos. Dozens of 911 calls. The sheriff finally approached him to let him know he was terrifying people. But here's the thing. What he was doing was completely legal under Oklahoma law. He was free to walk around with his guns, and shoppers, I suppose, were perfectly free to run screaming out of the stores he entered. I have to add a little dark humor postscript here. He was ultimately arrested because the sheriff discovered he was carrying with him that well-known weapon of mass destruction, a set of brass knuckles, which are completely prohibited under Oklahoma law. So there you have it. But I digress. Judging from the Supreme Court ruling this week on guns, this man's outfit will increasingly become the new fashion look of American freedom, coming soon to a shopping mall near you. Frankly, at that point, I was grateful, truly grateful for Paul. Because I think Paul's definition of freedom provides a welcome counterpoint to all this. Now, I need to give you a bit of background. If you read all of Galatians, it's easy to do, there's only 6 chapters, you will discover that Paul was very angry, actually hopping mad, when he wrote this letter. He has language that is so uncharacteristic of him. It's really interesting. The problem was this. It seems that other preachers had visited his little fledgling church in Galatia, a church largely made up of Gentiles, and they had said that to be a true follower of the way, to be a true follower of Jesus, one had to first be completely converted into Judaism, including submitting to circumcision. And that instruction had set off this fierce argument within the church, a really, really ugly dispute, judging by what Paul says. And Paul was livid. He kept saying, no, no, no. That instruction is completely wrong. You must not, as he put it, become subject to the law. by which he meant Jewish law and custom. Now pause there. We need to be very careful. For centuries, too many Christian commentators have decided that Paul was attacking Judaism as being legalistic and hence irrelevant to the followers of Jesus. No. This is a much more subtle commentary than that. Paul is not attacking the Torah, the Jewish books of instruction, nor is he attacking circumcision as in and of itself a bad thing. What he's saying is that those rules aren't necessary to follow Jesus, and to think that they are necessary is dangerous. Why? Well, I think Paul was drawing on his own experience. Here's a man who was a devout Jew. For that matter, he still was a devout Jew who believed that Jesus was the Messiah. But before he was blinded by the light on the road to Damascus, he had been not only devout, he had also been so excessively proud of his own righteousness and so focused on his unerring adherence to the law that he couldn't see beyond his own blamelessness. When he had been Saul the persecutor, he had looked out and seen not other children of God, but only people who failed to live up to his exacting standards. And where was love of God? And where was love of nature? The two central instructions in the Torah. Well, they were nowhere. So now, as he wrote this letter, Paul saw that this new obsession with following Jewish law was destroying his precious church in Galatia. Arguments, division, strife, all over whom among them was a better follower of Jesus, the circumscribed or the uncircumscribed. And they were, as Paul put it, biting and devouring each other over this point. And so Paul is shouting at them, none of that matters. You're missing the point. And in the verse you didn't hear this morning, he says what the point is. The only thing that counts is faith working through love. That's why Christ set you free. Now, unless we want to consign this as some weirdo argument about something we never think about 2,000 years ago, I need to point out that the history of Christianity is full of the failure to heed Paul's warning about what counts. Ours is a 2,000-year-old history soaked in blood. We know some of this. The perpetual violence that so-called Christians committed against Jews and still do. The Spanish Inquisition, the imprisonment of those who said the earth revolved around the sun, the burning at the stake of people whose crime was to translate the Bible into the vernacular. When I was studying this, I confess that when I got to the Protestant Reformation, I foolishly thought that the history would improve. But no, the Reformation, the one that legitimized the individual's own religious conscience, was the Reformation that also sanctioned violent persecution against any other Protestant group that ran afoul of whatever doctrine had been weaponized by the Protestant group in power. Talk to a Mennonite, for example. They can tell you a great many harrowing stories about being killed over the issue of baptism. Killed over their views on baptism. Ours is a history of biting and devouring each other, and all for the same reason. Because someone decided that their law, their doctrine, was the be-all and end-all of righteousness, so sacred that no one who disagreed could be tolerated. In short, Christianity has repeated the history of the Galatian church over and over again with far deadlier consequences. It's the tragic history of missing the point. It's the tragic history of ignoring Christ's freedom in exchange for settling scores. And so, my friends, we should joyously remind each other that curfew has ended. For freedom, Christ has set us free. Not the freedom to do anything we want, whenever we want, but the freedom that comes from love, and that's real freedom. Paul reminds us that when we live within that love, when we live as if the kingdom of God was already here, because it is if we make it so, the Spirit will bring us the gifts of that freedom, a kind of what Richard Rohr calls an emotional sobriety, more love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And if that sets us apart from the world in which we live, then frankly, that is to the good. So be it. St. Augustine summarized our freedom in one simple command with which I will end. What he said was love. Love and do what you will. May we let that freedom ring. Amen. Always forget I'm a part of this. I'm in charge of this now, too.